So, Tim, it's about time to get started and introduce you. If you want to turn on your camera here, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And so let me tell you all a little bit about Tim. First off, Tim, you're a practicing doctor, right?
That's correct.
That's right. Woo! I don't know what happened there.
Let's turn down my speakers a little bit. Does that help?
That helps a lot. I still hear a little bit in the background, but that's much better than the feedback we were getting. So yeah, you are a practicing family doctor in Oregon, correct?
Correct.
And so from what I've read about you, so you are actually been a consultant for all the major DNA companies for 23andMe, Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, and Ancestry.
Correct.
And the other interesting thing is the Mennonite connection. So you've been doing not just on DNA research, but just in genealogy research in general with the Mennonites. Do you have some Mennonite ancestry then? Is that where that interest is coming from?
Absolutely. My father is essentially 100% Low German Mennonite, except for a very small amount of Jewish ancestry that he also has.
Okay. All right. And so today you're going to be talking a little bit about GEDmatch, which you've also had some involvement with. You do some consulting with GEDmatch, or do you contribute to that as far as their programming?
No, I'm not really a programmer, but I have worked with John Olson and Curtis Rogers kind of off and on for the last 3 or 4 years anyway, maybe even earlier than that. So John and I sometimes talk on the phone. We deal with issues like triangulation and triangulated groups and phasing, things along those lines, which are really some of my key interests in this whole area.
Okay. All right. Well, great. Well, I'm going to turn the time over to you. One thing I'd suggest is why don't you turn your speakers off during your presentations? That way we don't get that feedback. And you can take it away.
Okay, so I'm going to dive into the slide presentations, and that's going to come up here hopefully soon. I'm not seeing the slides yet.
Did you press the start down at the bottom?
So let's see.
If you clicked on the 3 blue dots.
The pressed on slide presentations, and then
right. So if you click on the 3 blue dots, there should be one that says Tim Janzen. I'll set it up for you.
Oh, okay. I got it.
So yeah, so turn your speakers down so that way we don't hear that feedback, and you can take it away.
Okay, great. So let's go ahead and dive into GEDmatch here. First of all, I want you to know that you can download my presentation in its entirety using that tiny URL on the screen there. Hopefully you're seeing that entire URL. If you can't see it and read the entire portion of it, I'll just read it off to you right now. And that is tinyurl /Y9A9RHG9. And again, that's tinyurl /Y9A9RHG9. And that'll download it from my Google Drive. So I would encourage you to do that at some point so you have my entire slide deck for your reference. So what I'm going to do today is give you a very broad overview of GEDmatch from my perspective as somebody who uses it a lot, and particularly somebody who is particularly interested in genetic genealogy and genetic analysis and chromosome mapping and use of triangulated groups. So there's probably a lot of different ways people use GEDmatch. I primarily use the autosomal data, but other people may use primarily the genealogical data. My primary focus is on the autosomal data. So I'm just going to give you some background today about GEDmatch, and then also explain as many as I can of their tools that they have available for autosomal and X chromosome analysis. As almost everybody attending this conference understands, we're basically talking about autosomal DNA data, and this is basically a diagram or a picture of what a complete genome looks like, from chromosome 1 here that you can see on the left upper corner of your screen, down to the very smallest chromosomes 22, seen on the right lower corner. This is a male, so there's only one X chromosome and one Y chromosome. So a little bit more background about GEDmatch. Hopefully all of you are already using GEDmatch, but if you are not using GEDmatch yet, I would strongly encourage you to get involved and upload at least one file there so you can become an active participant in GEDmatch. GEDmatch was started by Curtis Rogers and John Olson in 2011. It provides a means basically for people to compare their data to each other, primarily autosomal data, but you can also compare X chromosome data as well. When GEDmatch first started, there were only several companies in the mix. Basically, 23andMe and Family Finder from Family Tree DNA were the earliest companies into this. But more recently, Ancestry.com and MyHeritage have also started offering products, and Living DNA is also providing data. So GEDmatch is now set up so you can handle uploads from all of these companies. And there's other companies also like WeGene that are contributors, and you can use their data as an upload as well. The other nice thing about GEDmatch is it allows you to have complete control over the data that you upload there. I'll give you an example. I recently had my deceased grandmother's DNA tested and did a complete genome sequence of her data, and she died in 2006. Fortunately, I'd saved a DNA sample, and I was able to have that completely sequenced by full genomes, and they provided me with a version 3 23andMe data file that I was able to upload into GEDmatch. And that's been very helpful for me to have for use. So I have now my grandmother's data on GEDmatch, as well as my parents' data and other close relatives. GEDmatch has quite a few different free basic options, but you can also subscribe as a tier 1 option for $10 a month, which is my preferred option. Some people, what they do is they don't subscribe necessarily every month, but they subscribe maybe 1 or 2 or 3 months out of the year, and that's an option for cost savings if you want to take that approach. So GEDmatch is particularly helpful for people who are only testing at Ancestry.com. So if you've decided that that's the only place you're going to test, what GEDmatch brings to you is another location where you can find matches and compare your data to other people. As many of you know, Ancestry.com does not at this time provide matching segment data. So as a result, if you want to compare yourself to somebody else who's at Ancestry.com, you need to convince them to upload a GEDmatch so that you can see the matching segment data. There are currently about 1.2 million people in the GEDmatch Genesis project, based on correspondence that I recently had with Curtis Rogers. And that's essentially the same number of people who are in the old GEDmatch database. They're experiencing about 1,500 or so new data files that are being uploaded each day. So GEDmatch is growing very rapidly, probably at least 300 to 400,000 new people joining every year, maybe more depending as time goes by. We'll see how quickly it grows. I've seen as many as 400 users online at any given time. The average during the day, from my standpoint, seems to be about 200 to 300 users, and during the evening when I'm frequently on here on the West Coast, about 100 to 150 people. So it's very widely used, and a lot of people are using it all of the time. Another nice feature about GEDmatch is it allows you to upload your GEDcom file. So I usually suggest that people do this, and it makes it much more convenient if there's both a GEDcom file as well as a raw data file uploaded for any one person. And you can link your self to someone in the GEDcom file so that that appears on your match list. So I would suggest you all do that, and it makes it much more convenient for your matches if there's both a GEDcom file linked to you as well as your raw data file being uploaded. GEDmatch actually has a huge amount of data from a genealogical perspective. There's 85,000 GEDcom files on GEDmatch, and these total about 190 million people at this point. So a huge amount of genealogical data in addition to the genetic data. All right. A few other things to keep in mind about GEDmatch. There are quite a few very nice background resources that you might want to make yourself aware of if you haven't already used them. They have a very nice frequently answered questions section at GEDmatch, which I've provided the URL for you if you want to look at that. There's also a forum where you can log in and get questions answered if you have interest in that. And then also just a general wiki that has been provided by GEDmatch that you can review and has quite a bit of data and background information as well. Hopefully those sites will help you with questions you might have. I should probably also mention that on Facebook, there is also a GEDmatch Facebook group that I'm a member of, and there's a lot of really talented genetic genealogists such as Ann Turner that are also on that Facebook group, and you might want to join that. Let's talk a little bit more about the Genesis Project. Essentially, all of my slides and all of this presentation are going to focus on the GEDmatch Genesis Project because the old GEDmatch website is going to eventually be phased out and everything is going over to the Genesis Project. So let's talk a little bit more about the background about why Genesis was created in the first place. Basically what happened is that Living DNA and 23andMe decided to switch to a new chip, and it's called the Illumina GSA chip, Global Screening Array. And this particular chip has relatively little overlap with the other testing companies. Normally, there are about 700,000 or so autosomal SNPs in a standard SNP chip that is used for genealogical purposes. But when the version 5 23andMe kit came out, it basically had only about 140 to 150,000 SNPs that were overlapping with the primary other testing companies. So this created a big problem because you don't have all of the data that you need to make good projections for what we call identical by descent matches or matching segments. And so John Olson and Curtis Rogers thought carefully about this, and they decided what they would do would be to create a different platform that would be for people who had tested at Living DNA and 23andMe on the newer chip. 23andMe is now on its fifth version. Versions 2 through 4 were quite compatible with the other testing companies, but version 5 was not so compatible. So this created this problem, and so they decided to create the Genesis Project as a result of that. Now, if you want to learn more about this topic, I would suggest that you go to a link that I've included here, which is at the ISOG Wiki, and Ann Turner and I in particular have contributed to this. What we've done is we've compared all of the major testing companies' raw data files against themselves and looked at the total number of SNPs, both autosomal and X chromosome SNPs that overlap between the various different testing companies. And you can check that out by going to this other URL over on the ISOG Wiki. All right. Some additional information about the Genesis project. So as of the end of December, GEDmatch has basically decided it was going to phase out the old website and start moving everything over into the Genesis project. Over the last year and a half or so, John Olson and Curtis Rogers have spent a lot of time on the Genesis project, so they decided to basically replicate all the old features that are in the standard GEDmatch website and move those over to the Genesis project platform. So they've migrated all the kits over now, so that's been done for almost a month now. They've developed a new type of algorithm for doing one-to-one comparisons. And they call this the Q-matching one-to-one. And it was particularly designed to help with the fact that in some areas of the genome, there's not very many SNPs overlapping among the various different testing companies. And so they've lowered the threshold for the number of SNPs that need to be included in a match. And this can be as little as 200, and it's a kind of a dynamic thing depending on which part of the genome you're talking about, but it's between 200 and 400 SNPs is their basic threshold. Some cases, you can have some relatively long segments in terms of centimorgans and still have relatively low numbers of SNPs. Now, this is both a good thing and a bad thing. The good thing about it is it allows you to see these matches, whereas otherwise you might not be able to using the standard threshold in GEDmatch, which was 7 centimorgans and 500 SNPs. Well, if you don't have that many SNPs to overlap, then of course you've got a problem. And so by lowering the threshold to as little as 200, they're trying to get around this whole issue. Now, this is a somewhat different approach than what other companies such as MyHeritage has taken, where MyHeritage is imputing all of the autosomal data, but the Genesis GEDmatch project is not. So there's no data being imputed. You're doing only comparisons of true tested SNPs when you're seeing these matches. So let's talk a little bit more about uploading data to GEDmatch. First of all, you need to create an account there if you haven't already done so. So I would encourage you to do that. And if you've already created an account, then you're probably familiar with this process. You need to go to the Genesis GEDmatch project to do the upload. So everything is going there now as of the end of December. And I've provided the link here for you for generic upload. So you want to click on that link if you're logged into GEDmatch, and then you're going to be uploading your file there. There's also a couple other options, which I won't go into with some other file types. But primarily, everybody's going to be using 600 to 700,000 autosomal SNP raw data file from one of these types of companies for upload. And then when you do upload your data, make sure you authorize the data to be put into the comparisons. Because if you don't do that, then no one else can see you as a match, and you're not going to be able to see others as a match either. So make sure you click on that little checkbox next to you authorize this data to be available for comparisons elsewhere. It's important to know about the basic kit numbers. So one of the things that if you've used GEDmatch for a while, you'll know that Ancestry.com kits start with an A, 23andMe kits start with an M, Family Finder kits start with a T. They used to start with an F, but there were some changes several years ago about that. And MyHeritage kits start with an H. And basically, from my experience, about half of all the kits now in GEDmatch are being imported from Ancestry.com customers. Now, when they started the Genesis project, they decided to create new kit numbers for the raw data files. So if you upload now to the Genesis project and you have an Ancestry.com kit, it will not start with an A. It will instead start with 2 letters followed by 7 numbers. And those are going to be all random. So you will not necessarily know just by looking at a new upload exactly what company the raw data came from. However, you can actually still get to this information by looking at the one-to-many comparison. And one of the options there is to look at the company that provided the data. So take a look at that if you have any questions about which company any specific raw data file came from for somebody who's uploaded more recently to the Genesis project. When you are on GEDmatch, you're going to be on the home page initially, and you're going to have all your kits listed there, so you can look at all the names of your kits and the kit numbers for everybody you've uploaded. It's important to know the basic status of all the kits, and if you want to delete a profile or edit it in some way, then you can look at the link next to it. That's the little pencil up in the left upper corner there. You can see that, and that can be helpful for you when you're looking at any one file to see what the status of that is. If it's in good standing, you're going to see the checkbox over there. And if you're basically not completely done or it hasn't been uploaded yet, you're going to see a waiting sign over here on the left side. And you can also see whether or not it's a research kit. So you can decide whether or not you want to create a kit that is a research kit only, where basically you can run comparisons against other people, but they can't necessarily see you, and that's determined by this research option. The other thing you can do is if you decide to create a phase data file through Lazarus or some other means, basically that'll create a little r type kit, and those can't be seen and can't be made public. So that's a special type of kit. And there's the occasional unknown, which won't happen very often. Another thing that has happened over the last 2 years is it's been a collaboration that's developed between the online One World Tree known as WikiTree and GEDmatch. And so they've been collaborating, and if you want to, you can actually create a link to your profile on WikiTree. So if you have uploaded your genealogical data to WikiTree and have created a profile there and have a pedigree chart there, then that is now compatible with GEDmatch. And that's a nice feature if you want to do that, other than uploading your GEDcom file to GEDmatch. And this is a very nice collaboration from my standpoint. And you can see this on the one-to-many feature. If you use GEDmatch, you can go there and you can scan through your matches and you can see who's linked to WikiTree. At this point, it seems to me that a relatively small percentage of people have created links to WikiTree, probably no more than 1 or 2% overall. Now let's talk a little bit more about the types of analysis you can do from a genetic standpoint at GEDmatch. The most important that I use all the time is looking for autosomal half-identical regions. So HIRs is what we refer to these as. If you're using phase data, of course, they're going to be not just half identical, they may be completely identical. But for most purposes, we're comparing unphased files on GEDmatch to each other, and you will therefore be able to compare those types of data files. You can also do comparisons on the X chromosome. We're going to talk a little bit about triangulated groups as well, though we won't get into that in great detail. And then I'm going to give some examples of admixture, which you can also see. And then the last thing I'm going to just briefly discuss is the various different tools that GEDmatch provides for GEDcom analysis. So GEDcom, or GEDmatch, is providing two primary autosomal DNA searches that you want to be aware of. These are the two that I use the most at GEDmatch, the one-to-many search and then also the one-to-one comparison. And a typical thing that is going on with me is I have a new match at GEDmatch that either I've encouraged to upload on their own or they've just come to in a GEDmatch independent of my encouragement. And so I'll be looking at these people, running one-to-one comparisons. I'll take the matching segment data, put it in my master match list spreadsheet, and then go to my chromosome map, see exactly how these people are related to me, at least in terms of which ancestral line they're related to me on. And then I look at their pedigree chart, and then we find a genealogical connection, if at all possible. That's not always possible to find the genealogical connection, but this is a basic process that I'm doing basically multiple times every week as I'm looking at new matches at GEDmatch. The one-to-many search feature helps look at all of your matches, and there's a number of different ways you can do that at GEDmatch as well, and we'll go through those during the rest of this presentation. So let's primarily look at the GEDmatch Genesis options. So I'm going to kind of just hit some highlights here. I'm not going to show every single link, but I want to just make sure you understand what the basic options are. First is a basic welcome, which is the beta version of Genesis there at the top. And then a second one that I use very regularly is the user lookup, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in an upcoming slide. There's some exome matches, which I'm not going to talk much about. And then if you want to still use the old GEDmatch website, you can still do that. I'm transitioning over so that I'm basically only looking at the GEDmatch Genesis website as of a month or so ago, and basically I'm not really using the old GEDmatch website very much anymore, except for a few special types of features. So the next section here is your uploads. We talked about this already, the types of files you can upload. This doesn't include MyHeritage and Living DNA on this particular link, but you can definitely upload their raw data files as well. And then there's VCF files, which you can upload, which most people aren't going to be doing. But if you have raw data files from other testing companies like Big Y or from Full Genomes, you can upload those as well. The next options are in basically the beta version of Genesis, and these are the free options. So the first one is the one-to-many comparison, and then the second is the one I use a lot, which is the one-to-one comparison. And then they just recently added the X chromosome comparison, so that's a nice new addition. We'll talk a little bit about the admixture options that they have. GEDmatch has collaborated with a number of very serious population geneticists and very active hobbyists in this field in the area of autosomal analysis, and they've created a number of different admixture tools that GEDmatch has incorporated into the website. So we'll show some examples later in the program about that. And then they've recently created a new option that I'm not going to talk too much about, which is you can do a population search. So you can search for different backgrounds, such as people with Jewish background, et cetera, and then run a ethnicity estimate based on that. Another very, very powerful tool is the one of two kits comparison. So basically, you can look at people who are matching other people and themselves. So I'll show an example later on of a second cousin to my mother, and we'll talk about this feature in greater detail. I'm not going to talk much more about the diagnostic utility, but if there's a problem with your file, you might want to run this utility to compare it. And then if your parents are related, you might want to check this out. The 3D browser is another new feature, and they have a 2D browser as well. And I'll talk more about those later in the program. Now, there are some tier 1 options that are available only if you've subscribed and are a paid member to Genesis. So I'm going to go through these in some detail during the next upcoming slide, so I won't highlight these a lot, but there's two different versions of the one-to-many comparison. The beta version of one-to-many that's at the top there is better for tagged groups. I mentioned already this Q matching one-to-one, which is this way that they get around the fact that there's not that many overlapping SNPs between a Living DNA or version 5 23andMe kit and the other standard kits that people have. And we're going to talk about segment searching, phasing, triangulation. Lazarus, as most of you know, Lazarus was a biblical a person who was raised from the dead. And so this is essentially a tool that allows you to recreate a phased file for one of your ancestors by using the DNA kits of the descendants of that particular person. And then I'll talk about the My Evil Twin, which is another baiting, a phasing tool that you might want to use. Okay, here's the next section. So you can upload your family tree, and that's done best by creating a GEDcom file. Most genealogical programs will allow you to do that. You can also create a GEDcom file from Ancestry.com if you have a tree there. And however you get to a GEDcom file, you can then upload it into GEDmatch and have that data available for you and other people to review. These are the primary genealogical searches that you can do. You can compare your GEDcom to everybody else in the whole database, or you can just simply compare your GEDcom or somebody else's GEDcom to another GEDcom within the database. So that can be very helpful for you as well. Then you can also search all of the GEDcom files. I would do that if you're trying to track down a specific ancestor and you want to know who else has that particular ancestor in your in their GEDcom file. You can do that. And then also something that they're developing is the GEDcom plus DNA matches. So that's a very nice tool that they're working on in addition. I want to make sure we cover some of the basics here. This particular tool is one that I use relatively frequently, and I like it a lot. I'm very glad that GEDmatch has provided this so that you can basically look up other users. So one of the most common things that I do when I use this tool is I am corresponding with somebody, and I don't know if they're in GEDmatch or not. So I can look up their email address in the lookup tool feature, and I can see if they have any kits in GEDmatch, and that can be very helpful. And also I can see what the how many kits they have, or I can also do this in reverse. If I have a GEDmatch kit number that somebody sends me, but I don't have their email address, then I can look up their email address so I can correspond by email, because I prefer email over the messaging systems that most of the testing companies have provided. So you can basically put in whatever you want to do in terms of either the kit number or the email address, or also you can search by a GEDmatch GEDcom file. So that's another way you can do it. And that's something that I do relatively frequently for my matches, is I'm wanting to know if they have a GEDcom on GEDmatch. So I go into this user lookup feature and see what's there. Now let's go to the basics. This is the one-to-one comparison screen, and this is what you need to become very familiar with if you aren't already aware of it. So first of all, you put a kit number in up at the top, and then a second one in, and these are the ones you're going to compare. So in my case, it's usually a family member that I'm wanting in the first line, and then the second line I'm going to be typically putting in a new match or somebody that I want to learn more about and run a one-to-one comparison. Now, I generally don't show the graphic bar for each chromosome, so I usually omit that, and I keep this on no for the second one here. Now, the minimum SNP threshold, we've talked about the matching SNPs a little bit already. If you're going to be using the basic comparison, you can just leave it at 700, but if you want to drop it, you can go down as low as 50 or so for the SNP count. I rarely do that, but sometimes I will drop the SNP count down to the 100 to 200 range for specific very small segments that I'm trying to research for one reason or another. In most cases, I leave the minimum SNP or the minimum centimorgan size as 7 centimorgans, but sometimes I drop that to 4 or 5, even for initial searches, if I'm wanting to look for smaller matching segments. And I don't generally mess with the mismatch window, but you can change that if you want to. Okay, let's run a comparison and see what it looks like. So in this particular case, I ran a comparison between my Uncle Robert, my mom's brother, and me. And you can see the matching segment data here. I've only included the first 3 chromosomes, but you can see the start and stop positions for the segments that we share in common. And you can also see the number of centimorgans and the number of SNPs in each one of these. And notice there's a fairly large number of SNPs in each of these comparisons. You can also do the one-to-many comparison. So in this particular case, I put in my mother's GEDmatch kit number, and I then click on Display Results. And then I get this kind of output. So my mother happens to be in GEDmatch twice, and she has 2 kit numbers. One is the one that from Family Tree DNA, Family Finder, and this other one is her 23andMe kit. So there, she's going to be completely matching herself, and you can see the centimorgan totals here. And then I have 2 other brothers, so you can see my brother Dan and my brother Phil showing up as matches to my mother here. And then I mentioned earlier that I was able to make a 23andMe version 3 kit for my grandmother, and that's also showing in here. And so the amount of centimorgans is exactly what we would expect for a parent-child relationship. And all 4 of these comparisons, and of course my mother's going to be identical to herself. And then these are my mother's 2 brothers. So Uncle Robert, who I mentioned, and then my Uncle Lawrence. So she shares a little less DNA with each of them, but they're right in the exact range we'd expect for a full sibling relationship. So you got the kit numbers over here. And another thing I want to make sure you see is these little A's. Now these A's are clickable. And if you click on these, what you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to go from the one-to-many comparison and then run a one-to-one comparison. So don't miss that feature within GEDmatch. You can go directly from the one-to-many over to a one-to-one comparison. It also tells what testing company, where it came from, it was migrated in, etc. And the date of comparison, all of this kind of information. So here's the Genesis one-to-one comparison as well. So if you want to go from the link that I just had back there earlier, and you click on that little A, then you can go here and do a comparison between my mom's kit from 23andMe and my Uncle Robert's kit. All right, let's go to a different portion of the GEDmatch website, which is this is a tier 1 feature, this matching segment search. So I use this intermittently. So the way I do it, depending on my busy schedule, I download the matching segment data probably about every 6 months or so is about how I typically am able to do it, because I don't have time to do this weekly or even monthly. But what I do is I download all the matching segment data, and then I compare that to the previous download. So then I only integrate the new matches out of my download, and then I integrate that into my matching match list spreadsheet. So I have another group of matches to correspond with and integrate into my master match list spreadsheet. The nice thing about this is you can get up to 10,000 of your closest matches. So that's the highest threshold at this point that GEDmatch is set for this. If you want to correspond with fewer people, you can set the threshold as low as 1,000. And I think this is probably the most important feature in GEDmatch, because this is where you can get all of your matching segment data in one bulk download. Now, they haven't created this as a Excel or CSV file yet, but I've encouraged John Olson to do that. But when you do get it, you get basically a web page, and you want to do Control A and then Control C to copy that data And I usually copy the output over into Notepad first. That removes all the formatting. And then I do Control C again within Notepad, and then I copy that over into Excel, and then I sort it and refine it as I need to. So that's a general technique that I use for getting the matching segment data. And as I mentioned earlier, you can integrate this data into matching segment data from other companies, such as 23andMe, Family Finder, or MyHeritage as well. This segment search can run a little slowly. You may take 10 or 15 minutes, depending on how many downloads you're trying to do, but a 10,000 download may take just a little bit of time. And then you can do more with this matching segment search. So here's just an example of this from my mom. So there's her kit number, and it's summarizing things. I've blanked out some of the kit numbers here, but this is the very top portion for chromosome 1, and then my 2 children, Bethany and Paul, also are showing up on this particular search. So this is comparing my mom and looking at the matching segment. You can see that there's 3 other people who have very similar segments to each other. They're probably related in one way or another. So this is what the format of the data looks like when it comes back from the matching segment search. Let's talk a little bit more about the search capabilities for people who match both kits or one of 2 kits. So the first thing you do is you enter a kit number up there at the top, and then you want to use that as your first kit and then a second kit. And I'll show an example of a comparison here between my mom and one of her second cousins, Malcolm Campbell. You set your thresholds here in terms of what you want to do. I usually leave these alone, and I usually leave the generational distance alone as well. But 10 centimorgans is pretty reasonable for what you want to have for this particular search capability. So this is what you get when you get the results back. I've deleted the names and the email addresses here, but you can see the comparison that's being run between my mother and Malcolm Campbell here, who's that GEDmatch number. You can see the shared numbers of segments. So what I did here is I went down and I ran a comparison between people who were just below the first and second cousin threshold. So these are third and fourth cousins to my mother and to Malcolm, related through my mother's grandmother, Anna Brown Armstrong. So you can see the difference between the amount of shared DNA that Malcolm shares with these people and my mother shares with them. And they're sorted by my mother first. So the biggest segments that my mother shares, or the matches, are going to be here, but there's obviously some pretty significant amounts of shared DNA with my mom's second cousin Malcolm as well. Very nice feature. This can take you then into another area of GEDmatch known as the multi-kit analysis. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. Here we've got my mom's kit, and we have Malcolm's kit over here on the right hand, and I've randomly chosen 4 kits. There were actually 4 that were in that last screen that I don't know actually the genealogical connection to. They're going to be 4th or 5th cousins, maybe even 3rd cousins once removed, but they're people not yet on my radar screen and haven't yet responded to emails that I've sent them, so I don't know exactly how I'm related to them. But in any case, we're going to go use this as a way to do some comparison here, and we're going to go through the multi-kit analysis section. There's several ways you can do this. You can either do manual kit entry like what we have here. This is one option, or you can do a tag selection group. Now, the other thing I want to make sure you know of is this visualization options. So this is a way you can look at the data in various different ways. So make sure that when you do this, you click in and look at those visualization options. So if you look at those visualization options, it gets you to this particular screen, and you see there's quite a few different things you can do. And I'm going to go through and comment on all of these to a certain extent, the different types of segment searches, the triangulation, two different types of chromosome browsers, a 3D and a 2D version, and then something that John Olson worked with Kitty Cooper on called the Compact Segment Mapper. There's also matrices. Take a look at that tab, the Lazarus tool, various lists and CSV files, tag groups, etc. The other links are there at the top of the screen. Okay, let's look at these a little bit more in depth. So here's the matching segment search option that I've clicked into. So here we're doing Malcolm versus my mother, and we see the shared segments that Malcolm has with one of these other matches, and you can see that Malcolm and this other match has the same segment right here, and then there's also a segment on chromosome 3. This is one of the visualization options. Now we're going to go and look at the triangulation option. So here's the same people again. So Malcolm versus Pete here, this comparison here, and I've juxtaposed these two slides, or screenshots. Basically, this lower portion appears on the right-hand side up next to Kit 2 in the right upper portion when you're looking at this on GEDmatch. So the first line corresponds to Pete here. And then the bottom 6 lines correspond with James, Chester, and the other comparisons that I've listed there. So you're basically getting a triangulated group. You can see that there are 6 people in this particular triangulated group. They're all sharing the same DNA segment. This is a segment that's basically about 12 to 20 centimorgans long. You can also look at the 2D chromosome browser option. And so here we're running a comparison between Pete and Malcolm here, and you can see how it's displayed. John has done some very nice things with graphics, and you can see the overlapping segments. You can see how long the segments are, 20 to 50 centimorgans for Malcolm, and then for Pete, it's a little shorter, but we're talking about a shared segment. So somewhere on my Armstrong line, Pete and my mom have a ancestor in common, and we have to figure out who that person is. So there's the 3D chromosome browser option as well, and you can basically, this is another way of looking at the data, and you can see the same types of comparisons here. Here we're seeing the numbers of segments that are shared in total. Not surprisingly, Malcolm and my mom are sharing a lot of DNA segments in common, 18 total. Chester and James seem to be related. They share 73 segments in total, so they're obviously closely related. This is another way of looking at the data in the 3D chromosome browser. So what we see here is that Malcolm and my mom are sharing 299 centimorgans. That's at the upper range of what we'd expect for a second cousin, but very reasonable. We would typically expect about 222 centimorgans to be shared for a second cousin relationship. So this is on the high end of that, but still acceptable. And then we see that James and Chester are sharing quite a bit of DNA. They're extremely likely to be full siblings. So 26 centimorgans would be suggestive of that. And the other people are not closely related because they don't share all that much DNA in common with each other. Here's another 3D chromosome browser option. And this is looking again at the matching segment details. So you can see this is on chromosome 1. You can see the start and stop positions for the matching segments, and that's all laid out for you. And then finally, the collaboration between Kitty Cooper and John Olson on the Compact Segment Mapper. Some of you may be using Kitty Cooper's tool that she's had available for about 4 years or so. And that's a very nice way to visualize your data and to do chromosome mapping. In this particular case, we are putting all the data onto from the comparisons we ran onto a chromosome display. And right here you can see that Malcolm, Patricia, Pete, and James are all sharing and Chester are all sharing the same segment. Excuse me, Pete is not sharing that same segment. He's sharing the segment up here at the top. But on chromosome 8, Malcolm, Patricia, James, and Chester are all sharing the same DNA segment. And that visualization option can be helpful for you. I'm not going to talk a lot about tag groups today, but I want you to know that you can do them at GEDmatch, and GEDmatch provides quite a bit of options there. I currently have just one tag group, just an Armstrong one. I put 8 of my mom's first and second cousins that are related on the Armstrong line into that tag group, and then I can do various different things with them. You can create tag groups for all your different ancestral branches if you want to, and it's just a nice tool that is available for you. I'm going to also talk about the matrices options. These are another tool that you have available to you under the multi-kit analysis link that I showed earlier, and I'm going to provide some examples of each of these. So the autosomal matrix comparison, you can click on that on the right side with the A matrix. You can also get a generations matrix. You can look at the X chromosome if you want to. You can look at the overlap in terms of the numbers of SNPs, and you can also look at fully identical regions if you want to. So let's take some screenshots. This is again from the exact comparisons that I was just running earlier on the other matching segment comparisons with Malcolm and my mother. So here's an autosomal matrix using that same group. You can see Chester and James down on the right lower side are siblings, and you can see my mom and Malcolm up in the left upper corner with 299 centimorgans shared. The other people are all sharing less DNA, so you see between 12 and 25. But this is and what you'll see on the left side is the names of the people, and up on the upper portion in real GEDmatch, you're going to see the kit numbers and the names of the people. But I just, for simplicity, I removed them from this particular screenshot. And the same applies here. You can see that James and Chester are related to each other in a very close relationship, about 1 generation apart. So that would be what we'd expect for siblings. And then Malcolm and my mother are 2.8 generations apart approximately, and they're in the left upper corner, and that's what we would expect for a second cousin relationship. The others are much more distant. Just a few comments about the generation distance. When you get out to about 4 generations or more distant, be very careful about the interpretation of this. I've seen some of the people that I correspond with, they interpret these as a precise measurement, but when we get beyond about 50 centimorgans or so, it can be difficult to know exactly what the precise genealogical relationship is. But as a general rule, third cousins share about 55 centimorgans, fourth cousins share 14 centimorgans, and fifth cousins share about 4 to 5 centimorgans on average. But there's obviously some wide variation there due to the random inheritance of the autosomal DNA segments. Okay, let's look at the SNP overlap. Well, we've talked a little bit about this at the very beginning of the presentation, but you'll see that the numbers of SNPs that are being looked at in the overlap here, some of these are Ancestry.com kits, and so there's going to be about 400,000 SNPs that are in comparison there versus a Family Finder or 23andMe kit. So that's where we see a lot of the 400,000 numbers of SNPs showing up here. If the comparison is on a kit that is from the same company, that's generally going to be at about 600,000. And we see some examples of that in this overlap as well. If there's a fully identical region, that picks up here as well. We see that Chester and James are sharing some fully identical regions. They share 716 centimorgans fully identical regions, which is fairly typical for full siblings. We're going to talk a little bit about triangulation here. So this is another option within the Tier 1 section of GEDmatch. You put in your kit number, and then you want to look at the closest matches. You can set this threshold in various different levels, 500 being the minimum. I usually lower this upper segment threshold limit. I usually lower this to about 200 to 500 centimorgans, so that that helps remove the close relatives like siblings and grandchildren from the analysis. And then another thing I really like is this option here, which you can look at just one chromosome if you want. It's set, the default is all, but you can, if you hit this drop-down menu, basically what you get is chromosomes 1 through 22, and you can look at all of those. And you can also do various different builds. I'm currently primarily doing everything in build 37. I may convert to build 38 if some of the other companies convert over to that, but I'm leaving everything in build 37 for the most part. Here's an example of the output. So if we run a triangulated group, you can see that these people here are sharing basically the same regions of a chromosome on chromosome 12. So there's a very, very similar overlap here, starting at the 8 million base pair position and ending at anywhere between the 20 and 28 million base pair region. So here's an example of this. So we see that all these people, Stephanie, Sarah, Bessie, Frank, etc., are all sharing the same segment, and the graphics that John Olson has created are displaying this too. So they all get the same color over on the right side if they're all part of the same triangulated group. And this is between 13 and 22, as many as for Stephanie up to 28 here. So this is a triangulated group, and they do a very nice job displaying that. And you want you want to try to figure out how you're related to these people and get their pedigree charts and look for shared ancestors or shared locations. Phasing is another thing I like about GEDmatch. So this allows you to basically get in and create phase kits for yourself, and you can see the phase kits that I've created for my wife and myself here. The My Evil Twin phasing is another option I encouraged John to create several years or so ago, and this is basically a phase kit for the DNA that a specific child didn't receive. So in my mom's case, this phase kit here is basically the matches that my mom has that were not also matches to me. And it can be a helpful tool, and it's only available on Tier 1. The Lazarus feature, I talked about that a little bit earlier, and you can create this. I've created a number of these, one for each of my mother's grandparents at this point. And you just basically put in the kits, and you can use the sex, etc. You want to make sure that you click on the button where it says full processing. So I would suggest that you do that when you create these kits. Otherwise, you won't be able to run this as a one-to-many. You want to be able to run this as a one-to-many. First of all, you have to put in the kit numbers of the people who are descended from the ancestor that you're talking about. So children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren of the ancestor you're trying to reconstruct. And then also people who are related to that ancestor in some way. So you need to have these different groups. So, and you put the kit numbers all in, and then you let it run its thing. And here's the type of analysis that you get. Like this is one I did for my grandfather several years or so ago, and gives you the kits that are used for the comparison and creation of this, and then the start and stop positions, numbers of shared centimorgans, and this is what the output that goes into it, and then a final summary about how many SNPs were used in comparison in creating the kit. You can do comparisons on the X chromosome, which are available here. I won't talk greatly about that, but it's very similar to the analysis you get with autosomal. And here's the comparison on that. Okay, to finish things up, we're going to basically just talk a little bit about admixture analysis. Admixture is kind of a hot topic. There's a lot of discussion about this. Another name for this is an ethnicity estimate. That's probably also a great way to do that. As I mentioned earlier, GEDmatch is paired up with a number of different population geneticists, and they've created these various different tools, which I've created mentioned here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you some screenshots from my mom and show you using most of these tools. These are the basic common ones. I use probably the MDLP World 22 the most for just kind of general things. But if you want to look at Europeans, I would suggest Eurogenes or DODECAD. And each of these has their own features, and I won't get into great detail about them, but I just want you to be aware of them. These are some of the ones you might want to consider for Europe, and the Jewish J test is an option. And then the admixture utilities, you basically select what you want here, and then go ahead and it'll process the information. It takes about 15 seconds or so to process the information. I'll give an example from my mom's ancestor. She has one Native American ancestor, which you may not be able to see very well, but there's an Armstrong line here, which I've referred to earlier. And there's a Native American ancestor by the name of Chief Tarhi, who was born in 1742, approximately. And there's a drawing or painting of Chief Tarhi. So if I run the admixture analysis for my mom, we see that she has some American ancestry here on Harappa World. So she's showing up as 1.79% for her American or North American or Native American ancestry. So that's about what I would expect. It appears that my mom is 1/128 Wyandot Indian, based on the ethnicity estimates that I've seen. That's consistent with the genealogy. And here the Native American is showing up with Eurogenes. It's 2.13%. If we go over to the DODECAD project, we see that that's showing up at Siberian is 0.97%. So that's the basic way to look at that. And then if we look at MDLP World, we see that my mother is showing up as 3.09% Mesoamerican. So that's how they're looking at it. Anyway, the ethnicity estimates are all a little bit different, but they're still all within a similar range. Now, if we take a look at my mom's chromosome map as compared, this is from MDLP1, we see that there's a black area here, which is her Native American. So that's showing up on chromosome 6. And there's a little bit here as well. I believe that's chromosome 18. And here's a close-up of the chromosome 6 section. The black would be the Native American segment. This is at between 150 and 160 million base pairs. And then finally, we have the GEDmatch comparison tool. I'm just showing you one example of this. And basically what this is, I ran a search for between my kit and somebody else's kit and found a match. And this happens to be one of the relatives of my mother through the Armstrong line. I've got a Bigelow line. If you're related to John Bigelow, feel free to send me an email. John Bigelow was the father of Sarah Bigelow. So this particular person is showing up as a match when I run the GEDcom comparison tool. So I can correspond with them and get more information from them about the Bigelows. All right. Well, I think we're about ready to take questions now. So I think that we're going to finish the presentation, make sure you download the entire presentation from this Tyranny URL that I'll leave here, and we'll leave this screen up. And thanks very much. We've gone a full hour, and now we're going to take about 15 minutes or so of questions. So, Andy, are you available?
Yep, I am. So let me go through a couple of these. You got a lot of questions going through here. So first is from Janice. She wanted to know how you were able to get your grandmother's DNA from 2008.
Are we available for questions?
Yeah, can you hear me, Tim? You need to turn your speakers on.
Let's see.
Hey, Tim, you need to turn your speakers on.
Hello?
Yeah, Tim, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I'm getting a lot of echo from your speakers there.
Okay, I'll turn it down.
Yeah, I'm just going to make a suggestion for when we do the panel discussion. You might want to try to find some headphones to just that way you'll be able to hear everything without that feedback on the microphone.
Okay.
So the first question that somebody had was, how did you get your grandmother's DNA back in 2008?
Okay. My grandmother died at the age of 99 in 2006. And at that time, basically, I was only familiar with Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch. So basically what the deal was I submitted a segment or a sample from my grandmother to the Sorensen Foundation. And at the same time, I decided, I don't know exactly what the applications of this might be in the future, but I decided to save half of the sample and I put it in my freezer. So the sample stayed there basically until a year and a half ago. And at that time, the price of complete genome sequencing had dropped low enough that I thought, I'm going to contact my good friend Justin Lowe over at Full Genomes and see what he can do to help me. And so he emailed me back and said, I've got this great geneticist down in North Carolina who's doing some wonderful extraction work for me. So maybe you want to go ahead and do a full genome sequence on this. So I went ahead and did that. I shipped it to the scientist in North Carolina. He extracted the DNA. There was plenty of DNA to run a complete genome sequence on the data. And then basically, once I had that back, Greg Magoon at Full Genomes created a 23andMe SNP file for me, which I then successfully uploaded into both MyHeritage and also into GEDmatch.
Okay, that's my guess is that probably is not an option that most people are thinking of, to put a piece of their grandmother in their freezer for I guess that was almost 10 years that it was sitting there.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. It was sitting there all those years. And let's keep in mind that there's technology to get DNA from the backs of stamps and licked envelopes and things like that. So that's coming down the pike. I've recently heard that MyHeritage is going to be offering that service in the near future. So I suspect that other companies are also going to be doing that.
Yeah, so that's something to look forward to for people. Make sure you're saving your letters that you may have from grandma and grandpa, and who knows how far back they'll be able to get with that. So next question, this is from Darlene, this is about living DNA. How can living DNA work when they don't provide matches? So how can GEDmatch be able to use that when living DNA doesn't provide matches?
So this comes back to the raw data files. I basically would suggest that everybody open their raw data files at some point from all the testing companies that they have tested with and take a look at them, because that's really kind of the basic data. And living DNA, they use the GSA chip. Actually, they're going to be switching, by the way, to an Affymetrix chip. That was announced about a month or two ago. They're switching from the GSA chip over to an Affymetrix chip. And I think that one of the reasons they decided to do that was there was more overlap between the Affymetrix chip and the old GSA chip that Illumina provides.
Okay. So it's because it's the raw file. It's not necessarily because whether the company provides matches. And like you said, you had this full genomics company that did your grandmother. What they were able to do is create a raw file that looked like a 23andMe raw file.
That's correct.
Okay. So Jeff has a question. What does imputed mean? You talked about how MyHeritage does some imputation of the SNPs, but GEDmatch doesn't. What does that mean to have imputed SNP data?
Well, this gets into some of the details of genetics, but basically the bottom line is that these companies create libraries of phased segment data. And the very sophisticated companies, specifically Ancestry.com, 23andMe, and MyHeritage, are all creating phased data segment files. And what these do is they basically provide a library that they can compare a phased segment to. So if they have, let's say, a phase segment that only has 200 SNPs in it, then they throw that up against their library and see what the best match is for a more complete segment. So let's say if that segment was 1,000 SNPs long for a specific region of the genome, if it was coming from, say, the Family Finder kit, but with living DNA having a lower amount of overlap, there may only be, say, 200 SNPs. So then a company like MyHeritage will essentially impute or guess what the other SNPs are in between the two regions of this area by using their segment library to fill in the details.
Okay. So I like what you said there is the key there is guess. You don't have the right data, but you're using the data around it to guess what that data in between is probably. And that means sometimes they're wrong on that.
Let me amplify that a little bit. What I'm doing personally is I'm trying to get all of my close family members tested on both a GSA chip and also on one of the other more standard chips like Family Finder, 23andMe, the old version, version 3, because that version 3 isn't available anymore, but you can still get the same type of basic data from MyHeritage or from Family Finder. Ancestry.com uses a somewhat different SNP set, so it's certainly reasonable to test there as well, just for the SNP set, let alone being in their database. But in any case, what I want to do is I want to create merged files at some point. I've actually corresponded with John about this just within the last week, and John has told me that he's going to be merging kits. So he's going to be creating merged files that will combine 2 or 3 or 4 different SNP sets from the various different companies, and then you'll have like a super kit, and that's going to be helpful.
Yeah, and I actually have created that myself from all 5 companies. I have all 5 companies, and I have the I think it's the version 2 of the 23andMe, which had the 900,000. It had the most of any of them.
No, that's version 3.
Or is that version 3? Okay, version 3. And so altogether, the new raw file, because there's still a lot of overlap between them, but it ended up being like 1.4 million SNPs. So almost double what most of the kits that you can buy now are. So that's great. I might have to talk with John and throw him over my sample one.
Yes, you can do that. The SNP kit that was generated by Greg Magoon from Full Genomes for my grandmother was 1.2 million SNPs originally, and then he pulled out of that just the 23andMe version, which was a little over 900,000.
Okay. All right. Well, there's some more questions. We're going to save those questions for our panel discussion, just so we have some time here to set up. And I know that you're headed off to a Portland Gen Forum or something right now, right?
Yes, I'm going to be giving the same presentation again, plus some additional topics on phasing and also on how to merge data from various different companies' match sets into your master match list spreadsheet. So I've got several other presentations to give today.
All right. Well, we'll see you back in a few hours when we have our panel discussion then.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you.